In part 1 of Russia's geopolitics, we talked about the external objectives of the Kremlin and how these objectives shape Russia's foreign policy. But equally important are Russia's internal dynamics, and the answer to this is connected with the historic decisions that transformed Russia into a centralized autocratic empire. And as unpleasant that empire was, that is how Putin's administration is governing the country today. You see, a decentralized Russia which endorses freedom and liberty can theoretically exist, but the last and only time Russia attempted to form a democratic free society was during the Yeltsin era in the 1990s, and that era is remembered for the Great Economic Depression, massive urban migration, and the nationalist religious secessionist movements in North Caucasus, which nearly broke Russia apart. For the Russians, this was evidence that Western values and principles could not work in Russia. So when Putin first came to power in the year 2000, he consolidated his position among the oligarchy and slowly changed the country back to a centralized bureaucracy. One of the first things he did was to return the Russian intelligence network to its prime position in the political system. He merged the Border Guard Service with the Federal Security Service, and basically he raised an army of 250,000 people for the intelligence apparatus. And then he further centralized the whole system by placing the FSB direct under the control of the president. Putin then moved to nationalize companies such as Gazprom, Rosneft, and United Aircraft Corporation, and used these companies for geopolitical means. If this sounds familiar, that is because Russia is returning to its historic authoritarian method of governance, and in this context we will look at the critical objectives within Russia. Welcome to a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. For more information, visit the social media pages. Russia has a population of 143 million. About 77% or 110 million live in the European part, and the remainder of 23% or 33 million live in the eastern part. The country is home to at least 160 different ethnic groups and indigenous people. About 20% of the total population is non-Russian. All of this spread over a country almost twice the size of Canada, and to keep everything running is an enormous undertaking to say the least. One of the historic and current problems of Russia is providing common goods to its central and far east cities. These cities are located so far away that the transportation costs are simply too high to make the goods affordable. So to keep everything running, the Russians drastically centralized the government and subsidized for the transportation expenses, and thereby reduced the prices of commodities and ultimately stabilized the country. But remember, not everyone wants to be part of the Russian Federation, and not everyone wants a centralized government. So to enforce central control and to suppress any secessionist or nationalist movements, Russia needs a strong intelligence foundation. What you have to understand here is that the Russian intelligence apparatus is one of the largest and one of the most sophisticated networks out there. It is only rivaled by the American and the Chinese. And the main agency, the FSB, focuses on the former Soviet states, and more importantly, the FSB mostly focuses within Russia. The agency has infiltrated every large political, security, and business realm in the country, all the way up to the highest levels. This includes organized crime and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russians have been building their network for at least half a century. So when the Americans support NGOs and call it human rights activities, the FSB suppresses them and calls it foreign interference. The role of the FSB is further highlighted in its fight against separatist movements in the North Caucasus, and this is another objective that Russia has to deal with. The truth is that the ethnically and religiously diverse North Caucasus is a flashpoint within Russia. Many of the native populations in Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia oppose any kind of Russian ruling. If even one of these regions manages to break off, it would have a domino effect throughout the entire region and the remainder of Russia. Secessionist movements would spring up in Circassia, Karachay-Cherkassia, and even in far-away regions such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chufassia, etc. Even Europe's only Buddhist state, Kalimkia, would be part of that uprising. And this secessionist domino would also extend to Russian majority regions such as Kaliningrad. So therefore it is imperative that the FSB is in control of Dagestan, Chechnya and Ingushetia. This is where the separatist domino would kick off. The FSB strategy to deal with this issue was by turning the whole conflict into a civil war amongst the Caucasians. So nowadays it's a matter of delicately managing that civil war. Ultimately, Russia needs to maintain a centralized form of governance to keep everything running. And they need to maintain a strong intelligence network to keep everything stable. A side effect of this is that Russian institutions and civil societies will further weaken as the country will become more and more authoritarian. It's not really 21st century or even fair, but Russia simply doesn't have any other alternative solution. And this is just the way things are done. The third Russian objective is to modernize its army, air force and military industries. The thing with a standing army is, you have to equip it with the best possible equipment and acquire the best possible vehicles at all times. Anything less than this is like a barking dog that can't really bite. Russia is already in midst of modernization, but still lags behind in quality when compared to NATO. Having a combat-ready military doesn't mean you actually have to use it, just having one ready is sufficient. This also applies to the military industry. You see, the Russian military industry has its financial limitations, and over the past few years, this has created several technological shortcomings, meaning Russia's military hardware has gotten less and less competitive over the years. When you can buy a German BMP that outperforms the Russian one, then the Russian industry is losing clients and thus taking a loss in sales. Also, having a competitive military industry prevents Russia from being dependent on foreign military supplies. So this serves an important goal. And to keep its industry alive and profitable, Russia needs to keep it competitive. And one way that Russia manages this is by promoting cooperation between Russian and Western military companies. Now you may have noticed that the Russian Navy wasn't mentioned. That is because the modernization of the Navy is simply irrelevant. Russia doesn't have any warm water ports with open ocean access, so any modernization in this field is merely symbolical. But this does bring forth the next objective: gaining control over warm water ports with open ocean access. This endeavor would enable Moscow to expand its commercial ties and gain access to the global trading system through the oceans. Now, it's true that Russia does have ports in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, but both these ports are blocked by the Turkish and the Danish Straits. And since both these countries are part of NATO, it restrains Russia's naval capabilities to such a degree that the Baltic and Black Sea ports become obsolete. One thing that is important to note is that sea-based trade has on the average 10 times lower transportation costs than land-based trade. That is a significant margin, and so the importance of this goal cannot be overstated. Only if Russia ever manages to acquire a warm water port, only then it would make sense to build up a strong navy. But the thing is, the Russians have been trying to control a warm water port for centuries. The closest they came was during the Russian-Japanese War of 1905, but they lost that war. Even a global power such as the Soviet Union never managed to accomplish this goal. So in the current situation, this objective is far beyond Russia's reach. The final critical objective for Russia is the modernization of its energy industry. Given that energy revenues form a large portion of the Russian budget, it's essential that Moscow maintains the production levels. The problem is that as time goes by, more and more of Russia's energy resources are extracted from remote and far regions. This raises the costs of transportation and extraction and lowers the production levels. So over time, things will get more expensive and less profitable. Therefore, it is important that Russia develops new technologies to increase the production levels in the long term. One way to achieve this is by promoting cooperation between Russian firms and European and American energy companies. These are the most important internal dynamics of Russia that keep the country going and keep the country stable. And together with the Russian interests in the former Soviet countries, which we explained in a previous report, together they form the geopolitics of Russia. And even though Russia is clearly a strong and influential regional power, it is not a global power. Only if Russia can maintain its internal dynamics and overcome its external objectives, only then can Russia return to its superpower status. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Thank you for watching and sağ ol.